Kicked out by his own family at 15 years later, they came back. Lucas was 15 when his own family told him to leave and never come back. No suitcase, no plan, just a door closing behind him. He slept on couches, buses, anywhere that didn't ask questions. Years passed, and Lucas learned how to survive without anyone. Then one night, his phone buzzed with a name he hadn't seen in years. The message was short, careful, almost afraid. They wanted to see him. They said it was important, but they didn't say why no, W, or what they really came back for. Lucas stared at the phone until the screen dimmed. The name still burned into his mind like a bruise pressed too hard. He was 30 now, old enough to know that silence could be safer than answers, but his hands still trembled the way they had when he was 15 and afraid of the dark. The apartment around him was small and smelled faintly of dust and burnt coffee, a place earned through years of caution rather than comfort. He sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the hum of traffic outside, feeling the past press in from all sides. He had built his life on the assumption that they were gone for good. The message felt like a crack in a wall he had spent half his life reinforcing. He told himself he didn't owe them anything, not even a reply. Still, the name refused to let him breathe. He thought about the night he was sent away, the way his mother wouldn't meet his eyes, and his father's voice stayed flat, as if reading instructions. There had been no shouting, which somehow made it worse, because calm meant they were certain. He remembered standing on the porch with a thin jacket, and nowhere to go, the house lights turning off one by one behind him. That memory had followed him through shelters, through borrowed beds, through mornings when he woke up hungry and pretended he wasn't. Survival had been learned in small humiliations and quiet victories. He had promised himself that if he ever felt steady, he would never let them shake him again. Yet the message had already done its damage. It reminded him that stability was something he performed, not something he owned. Lucas finally picked up the phone, reading the message again as if it might change. The words were polite, almost formal, and that frightened him more than anger would have. Important was a word people used when they wanted to justify reopening old wounds. He wondered who had written it, and whether the others even knew. The idea that they had discussed him, weighed him, decided he was useful again made his stomach tighten. He had learned to distrust sudden concern. Care had always come with conditions in that family. The years had taught him that being needed was often more dangerous than being unwanted. He tried to imagine what they wanted, and every possibility felt like a trap. Illness crossed his mind first, because it was the kind of reason people thought erased history. Then came money, a word that carried its own familiar bitterness. He had seen enough people crawl back to estranged relatives when desperation set in. The thought that he might be their last option made him feel both powerful and small. He hated that part of himself that wanted to know. Curiosity, he had learned, was another form of hunger, and hunger had always led him somewhere cold. Lucas stood and paced the apartment, his footsteps measured, controlled, as if movement could settle his thoughts. On the wall hung a single photograph from a life he built alone, proof that he existed outside their story. He stopped in front of it, studying his own face, older and sharper than the boy they had sent away. That boy had believed everything adults told him. This man trusted patterns instead. Families did not disappear for years and then return without a reason that served them, knowing that should have made the decision easy. It didn't. He opened a window and let the night air in, breathing until his chest stopped aching. The city below didn't care about his past, and that anonymity had saved him more than once. He thought about the people who had helped him along the way, strangers who asked nothing and expected less. None of them had ever come back to demand something later. That contrast hurt more than he expected. It suggested that blood had never been the strongest bond in his life. The realization made him angry in a way he had never allowed himself to feel. When he finally sat down again, the phone felt heavier in his hand. He typed a response and erased it 3 times, each version revealing more than he wanted. Agreeing felt like surrender. Refusing felt like unfinished business. He realized that part of him needed to see them, not for reconciliation, but for clarity. There were questions that had followed him for 15 years, questions no amount of distance had answered. He needed to know if they remembered the night they closed the door. He needed to know if they believed they had been right. Lucas sent a short reply, neutral and controlled, asking where and when. The moment the message went through, a strange calm settled over him. It wasn't relief, but it wasn't fear either. It was a feeling he got before doing something difficult but necessary. He told himself he could walk away at any moment. He told himself he was no longer that boy on the porch. Yet as he turned off the light, one thought kept him awake. What if seeing them again proved that the past still owned more of him than he wanted to admit? The cafe they chose sat on a quiet corner he rarely walked past, its windows fogged with the kind of warmth meant to feel inviting. Lucas arrived early out of habit, choosing the table farthest from the door, where he could see everything without being seen. He wrapped his hands around a mug he barely touched, grounding himself in the heat while memories pressed close. Every sound felt amplified. The scrape of chairs, the hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of strangers who had nothing to do with his life. He reminded himself that he had survived worse rooms than this one. Still, his pulse betrayed him, tapping against his wrist like a warning. He watched the door with the patience of someone used to waiting for disappointment. Time stretched, and with it, the weight of what he had agreed to face. When they finally walked in, he recognized them immediately, despite the years that had reshaped their faces. His father's hair had thinned, his posture slightly bent as if the certainty he once carried had eroded. His mother looked smaller, wrapped tightly in her coat, her eyes scanning the room before settling on him. There was no rush toward him, no open arms, just a hesitant pause, as if they weren't sure he was real. Lucas felt a sharp, unexpected sting at how ordinary they looked. He had imagined them as larger figures, looming and decisive, but time had reduced them to people who could grow tired and uncertain. That realization unsettled him more than anger would have. They approached the table slowly, and his mother said his name like she was testing it, afraid it might break. He stood out of reflex, then stopped himself, choosing instead to remain seated. The small act felt like reclaiming something he had lost long ago. His father cleared his throat and asked how he was, a question that landed with a dull thud. Lucas answered honestly but briefly, unwilling to offer details that could be mistaken for an invitation. He watched their faces carefully, noticing how they avoided his eyes when he mentioned work, how relief flickered when he didn't ask about the past. Silence filled the space between them, heavy and practiced. They spoke about neutral things at first, the weather, the cafe, the city changing in ways they barely recognized. Lucas realized they were circling something, building courage in small, careful steps. His mother's hand shook slightly as she reached for a cup, and he wondered when she had learned to look fragile. It occurred to him that they had aged without him, just as he had grown without them. That mutual absence felt like a third presence at the table. He resisted the urge to fill the quiet, letting it stretch until it became uncomfortable. Discomfort, he had learned, often forced honesty. Finally, his father sighed and leaned back, the sound carrying years of unspoken strain. He said they wouldn't have reached out if it wasn't necessary, and Lucas felt his jaw tighten. Necessary was a word that erased choice, and he recognized it immediately. His mother nodded, her eyes fixed on the table, as if answers might be written there. Lucas waited, his expression unreadable, even as a familiar ache settled in his chest. He had expected this, yet hearing it spoken made it real. He braced himself for the ask. They told him about the house, about debts that had piled up quietly until they could no longer be ignored. His father's voice grew thinner as he explained decisions made too late, risks taken out of fear. Lucas listened without interrupting, each sentence confirming what he already suspected. This wasn't about reconciliation or regret. It was about survival, the same lesson he had learned at 15. The irony tasted bitter. He wondered if they realized how similar their situation was to the one they had forced on him. When they finally mentioned his name in connection to help, the air shifted. His mother looked up then, her eyes pleading a way that made him look away. She said they knew they had no right to ask, that they understood if he said no. Lucas noticed how carefully she avoided apologizing. Responsibility, he realized, was still a line they refused to cross. He felt a slow burn of anger rise, tempered by a strange sense of distance. This was no longer happening to him. It was happening in front of him. He told him he needed time to think, his voice steady despite the storm beneath it. His father nodded quickly, relief flashing too soon to hide. That reaction told Lucas more than words ever could. They had come with expectations, not hope. As he stood to leave, his mother reached out and stopped herself, her hand hovering in the space between them. Lucas paused and stepped back, creating a clear boundary. He wished her well, a phrase that sounded polite and hollow even to his own ears. Outside, the air felt colder, sharper, and he welcomed it. He walked without a destination, letting the city absorb his frustration. The meeting had answered some questions, but opened others he hadn't anticipated. He knew now why they had come back, but not what he would do with that knowledge. As he crossed the street, one thought settled heavily in his mind. If he helped them now, would it finally close the door they had left him outside of, or would it prove they had always believed he was there to be used? Lucas did not sleep much that night, the conversation replaying itself with an insistence that felt almost physical. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the building settle and creak as if it carried its own exhaustion. Every word his parent had chosen seemed rehearsed, sanded smooth to avoid splinters, and that carefulness disturbed him more than hostility would have. He had spent years learning how to read people who wanted something from him, and the signs were familiar. What unsettled him was how easily his body remembered the old hierarchy, how quickly his chest tightened as if he were still waiting for permission to exist. He hated that part of himself, the reflex that time had not erased. The night stretched on, thick with unasked questions. By morning, he knew he needed distance to think, but distance had always been a complicated concept for him. He went to work on autopilot, nodding through conversations, completing tasks with a precision that required no emotional investment. His co-workers saw him as reliable, quiet, someone who never brought personal problems into shared space. That reputation had been earned through years of discipline, through the belief that vulnerability was a luxury he couldn't afford. Yet that day, every small interruption felt like an intrusion. He found himself replaying his mother's expression, the way her eyes had searched his face for something she could use. The realization made him feel both angry and ashamed, as if he had allowed a door to crack open. During his lunch break, Lucas walked to a nearby park and sat on a cold bench, watching people move through lives that did not intersect with his. Parents scolded children. Couples argued quietly. Strangers passed without acknowledgement. It struck him how ordinary conflict looked from the outside, how rarely it carried the weight of hell for those inside it. He wondered what his parents told themselves about the night they sent him away, whether they had rewritten it into something manageable, something that allowed them to sleep. The idea that they might have framed it as necessary rather than cruel made his stomach churn. He realized he had never heard their version of that night. That afternoon, his phone buzzed again, this time with a follow-up message that asked if he had thought about their request. The timing felt strategic, as if urgency might corner him into compliance. Lucas stared at the screen, resisting the impulse to respond immediately. He remembered nights when hunger had dictated his choices, when urgency had been a weapon turned against him. He refused to let that pattern repeat. Instead, he put the phone away and focused on his breathing until the tension eased. Control, he reminded himself, was something he had earned. When he returned home, he pulled out an old box from the back of his closet, one he rarely opened. Inside were fragments of a life interrupted, a few photographs, a report card, a letter he had never sent. He sat on the floor, sifting through the contents with care, noticing details he had ignored before. In one photograph, his family stood together, smiling stiffly, already arranged as if something were missing. He studied his younger self, trying to remember what he had believed then. The boy in the picture still trusted the people beside him. That trust felt like a relic from another world. As evening settled, Lucas made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He would meet them again, but not to discuss money. There were questions he needed answered before anything else could happen. He needed to hear them acknowledge what they had done, without excuses or softened language. He knew there was a risk in asking, a chance that their refusal would reopen wounds he had carefully sealed. But avoidance, he realized, had its own cost. It left too much power in the hands of the past. He wanted to see if they were capable of meeting him where he stood now. He sent a brief reply, agreeing to another meeting and suggesting a different place, one closer to his neighborhood. The choice felt symbolic, a quiet assertion of territory. Almost immediately, his mother responded with gratitude that felt excessive, her relief spilling through the screen. Lucas noted it without comment, already bracing himself for what was come. He knew that people rarely welcome conversations that threaten their self-image. Still, the decision steadied him. It felt like moving toward something rather than away from it. The days leading up to the meeting passed slowly, each hour stretching under the weight of anticipation. Lucas found himself thinking about the concept of forgiveness, not as something noble, but as something practical. He wondered who it was meant to serve, the forgiven or the forgiving. He had survived without it, built a life that functioned despite its absence. What he wanted now was not absolution, but truth. As the night before the meeting arrived, one thought anchored itself firmly in his mind. If they could not face what they had done, then their need would never outweigh his right to walk away. The second meeting took place in a modest diner near Lucas's apartment, a place he knew well enough to feel anchored. He arrived first again, choosing a booth with his back to the wall, the vinyl seat cracked from years of use. The smell of frying oil and old coffee reminded him of nights when this kind of place had been a refuge rather than a backdrop. He ordered water and waited, watching the door with a calm that felt practiced but fragile. This was his territory now, and the awareness gave him a measure of control. He told himself that control did not mean safety, only preparedness. Still, it was enough to keep his hands steady. His parents entered together, moving with the same tentative synchronization as before. His mother noticed the familiarity in his greeting to the waitress, and something flickered across her face that Lucas chose not to interpret. They slid into the booth across from him, the table suddenly feeling too small for what he intended to say. There were no pleasantries this time, no easing into comfort. Lucas let the silence stretch until it demanded attention. He could see his father bracing, shoulders tightening as if expecting impact. The tension felt earned. Lucas spoke first, his voice even, outlining what he needed before any discussion of help could continue. He said he wanted to talk about the night they told him to leave, and the words landed heavily between them. His mother inhaled sharply, her eyes dropping to the table, while his father stared past Lucas's shoulder as if the memory lived somewhere behind him. Lucas noticed how quickly discomfort took shape, how practiced they were at avoiding it. He did not rush them. He had learned that patience could be a form of pressure. The diner's background noise filled the gap, indifferent and constant. His father finally spoke, choosing his words with care that bordered on avoidance. He said they had been overwhelmed then, that circumstances had felt impossible, that they had done what they believed was necessary. Lucas listened, noting the absence of his name in the explanation, the way responsibility dissolved into abstraction. His mother added that they thought he would be better off, that he was strong and resourceful even then. The compliment felt misplaced, a retroactive justification, rather than an acknowledgement of harm. Lucas felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the old urge to accept whatever explanation was offered just to end the discomfort. He resisted it. He asked them why they had never reached out before, why 15 years of silence had seemed acceptable. The question hung in the air, heavier than the last. His mother's eyes filled, but no tears fell, and Lucas recognized the restraint as something learned long ago. She said they assumed he didn't want to hear from them, that reaching out might make things worse. His father nodded, adding that they believed distance was kinder. Lucas absorbed this, understanding too well how easily kindness could be defined to suit the person offering it. The answer felt insufficient, but it was honest in its own way. Lucas told him about the years that followed, not in dramatic detail, but enough to make the cost visible. He spoke of sleeping in places where he never fully relaxed, of learning to measure people quickly, of carrying everything he owned on his back. He did not accuse or raise his voice, and that restraint seemed to unsettle them more than anger would have. His mother pressed her lips together, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while his father's gaze finally met Lucas's. There's something like shame there, muted but present. Lucas felt no satisfaction in it, only a tired recognition. The waitress returned with their orders, unaware of the shift at the table, and the interruption felt jarring. They waited until she left before Lucas continued. He said he needed to hear them acknowledge that what they did had been wrong, without conditions or explanations. The words felt heavy but necessary. His father's face tightened, a flicker of defensiveness passing before he looked away. His mother whispered his name, as if it might soften the demand. Lucas held their gaze, refusing to retreat. After a long moment, his mother spoke, her voice unsteady but clear. She said they had failed him, that sending him away had been a decision born of fear, not care. The admission seemed to cost her something tangible, as if she were relinquishing a long-held shield. His father followed more slowly, his apology measured and incomplete, but present. Lucas listened, weighing the words not for sincerity alone, but for responsibility. They had named the harm, even if they did not fully grasp it. That mattered more than he expected. When the conversation ended, the food untouched and cooling between them, Lucas felt an unfamiliar mix of exhaustion and clarity. Nothing had been repaired, but something had shifted. As they stood to leave, his parents waited, uncertain, as if expecting direction. Lucas told them he would consider their request, now that the truth was on the table. Walking home afterward, the night air felt different, less oppressive. He realized that hearing them admit fault had not erased the past, but it had changed its shape. The question that lingered now was whether acknowledgement was enough to justify reopening a door he had spent years learning to live without. The days after the diner meeting unfolded with a strange, muted intensity, as if Lucas were moving through a version of his life that had been subtly altered without his consent. Nothing concrete had changed, yet everything felt slightly off balance, like furniture rearranged in the dark. He went to work, answered emails, cooked simple meals, and nodded politely at neighbors, all while carrying the weight of conversation that refused to settle. The acknowledgement his parents had offered echoed in his thoughts, not as comfort, but as an unresolved sound. He had imagined that hearing them say they were wrong might bring relief or closure, but instead it left him alert, watchful. Old wounds, he realized, did not simply close when named. They shifted, sometimes painfully, into new shapes. At night, memories surfaced uninvited, no longer sharp but persistent, like pressure behind the eyes. He remembered the early days after he was sent away, the way every kindness from strangers had felt suspicious, temporary. He recalled learning which shelters were safest, which couches came with unspoken expectations, which smiles meant nothing at all. Those lessons had become instincts, woven into how he navigated the world. He wondered how different his life might have been if he had not needed to learn them so young. The thought did not spiral into self-pity, but it carried a quiet grief he rarely allowed himself to feel. Grief for a version of himself that had not been forced into resilience. His parents did not contact him during that week, a restraint that felt intentional. Lucas noted it with a mix of appreciation and wariness, aware that patience could be another strategy. He found himself checking his phone more often than usual, not because he wanted to hear from them, but because he wanted to be prepared if they reached out. Control, once again, became his anchor. He began to think about money in practical terms, not as leverage or symbolism, but as a resource with consequences. He could help them. He knew that much, but the act itself would not be neutral. It would create a new dynamic, one that might blur boundaries he had fought hard to establish. Midweek, Lucas took a long walk through his neighborhood, letting familiarity steady him. He passed places that held quiet significance. The grocery store where the cashier knew his name, the laundromat where he had once spent an entire winter evening waiting out the cold. These were markers of a life built slowly, deliberately, without assistance from the people now asking for it. He wondered if helping them would feel like honoring his own survival or betraying it. The question followed him block after block, unresolved and heavy. He realized that no decision would be free of loss. The choice was not between right and wrong, but between different kinds of cost. That evening, he received a message from his mother that did not mention money or urgency. She wrote about sorting through old boxes in the house, about finding a sweater he used to wear and not remembering why she had kept it. The message ended without a question, as if she were offering a fragment of memory rather than asking for response. Lucas stared at the screen for a long time, unsettled by the shift in tone. It felt less strategic, more tentative, and that unsettled him more than direct requests ever had. Vulnerability, he had learned, could disarm as effectively as pressure. He did not reply immediately, choosing instead to sit with the discomfort. When he finally responded, his message was brief, acknowledging the memory without engaging it. He did not ask questions or offer reassurance. The boundary felt necessary, even if it made him feel cold. He reminded himself that consistency mattered more than warmth, at least for now. Trust, if it were ever to exist between them again, would have to be rebuilt on terms that did not erase the past. He suspected his parents might not fully understand that distinction. Understanding, however, was no longer his responsibility to facilitate. As the week came to an end, Lucas made a list, not of pros and cons, but conditions. He wrote down what helping them would require, not financially, but emotionally. He would not move back into their orbit or become a regular presence in their lives. He would not accept guilt as currency or gratitude as obligation. The list surprised him with its clarity, revealing how much he had already learned about protecting himself. It also revealed something else, something quieter and harder to admit. Part of him wanted to help, not out of duty, but out of a desire to prove that he could choose generosity without being consumed by it. He slept better that night, the decision still unmade but taking shape. In the morning, he drafted a message asking to meet one more time, this time to discuss specifics. He felt steady as he sent it, aware that whatever followed would be guided by his terms. The reply came quickly, gratitude woven through every word, and Lucas noted again how relief always seemed to arrive before understanding. He prepared himself for that meeting with the same care he had given the others, grounding himself in routine and intention. This was not reconciliation. He reminded himself. It was negotiation. The third meeting took place in his apartment, a choice Lucas had debated carefully before making. Inviting them into his space felt risky, but it also felt honest. He wanted them to see the life he had built, not as proof or performance, but as context. When they arrived, they looked around quietly, taking in the small, orderly rooms with expressions that hovered between pride and regret. Lucas watched them closely, noting how his mother touched nothing, how his father stood awkwardly, unsure where to place his hands. The imbalance was subtle but real, and Lucas felt its weight settle differently this time. This was his ground. They talked numbers first, practical and contained, and Lucas appreciated the simplicity of it. He explained what he could offer and what he could not, laying out boundaries without apology. His parents listened, nodded, asked clarifying questions, and for once did not push back. The absence of resistance felt significant, though Lucas did not mistake it for transformation. When the conversation shifted, inevitably, toward emotion, he guided it carefully, refusing to let it spiral into absolution or self-flagellation. He did not need their suffering to validate his own. He needed respect. By the time they left, an agreement had been reached, clear and limited. Lucas closed the door behind him and stood in the quiet, feeling the echo of their presence fade. He did not feel triumphant or relieved, only settled in a way he had not anticipated. He realized that helping them had not reopened the door of his past so much as reframed it. The power dynamic had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. Still, as he sat down and let the silence return, one question lingered with stubborn persistence. Had he just proven that he could engage without losing himself, or had he taken the first step back into a story that would never truly let him go? After the agreement was set, life did not return to normal so much as it settled into a new, uneasy pattern that Lucas had to learn how to carry. The financial help went through quietly, without ceremony, and with it came an invisible thread connecting him back to a house he had not stepped inside for half his life. He noticed a change in small ways, moments when his phone vibrated and his body reacted before his mind did, or when a stray memory surfaced uninvited during an otherwise ordinary task. He had expected resentment or regret, but what surprised him most was vigilance. It felt like standing guard over something fragile, unsure whether the threat was external or already inside him. Helping them had not hurt him, but it had awakened something watchful and tired. His parents began sending occasional updates, short messages about repairs, about conversations with creditors, about steps being taken to stabilize their situation. Lucas read them carefully, looking not just at what was said, but at what was avoided. The tone remained cautious, respectful, almost formal, as if they were afraid of triggering something irreversible. He appreciated the restraint, even as it underscored how little intimacy remained between them. They were learning new rules, ones that did not place him at the center of his life, and that adjustment showed. He wondered if they felt the same tension he did, the sense of navigating unfamiliar ground with no map. As weeks passed, Lucas noticed changes in himself that were harder to define. He found it more difficult to dismiss thoughts of the past, not because they were overwhelming, but because they felt newly relevant. Scenes he had compartmentalized for years resurfaced with sharper edges, now reframed by recent conversations. He remembered arguments he had not understood at 15, silences that had felt random but now appeared deliberate. Patterns emerged that made him reconsider the story he had told himself about his departure. It had been simple to believe they were cruel, than to accept they were weak. That realization did not excuse their actions, but it complicated his anger in ways that left him unsettled. One evening, Lucas received a message from his father asking if they could talk, not about money, but about something else. The phrasing was careful, almost hesitant, and Lucas felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He considered ignoring it, maintaining the boundaries he had set, but something in the request felt different. Curiosity surfaced again, quieter this time, less urgent but persistent. He agreed to a call, choosing a night when he felt grounded enough to handle whatever might surface. When the phone rang, he let it buzz once before answering, giving himself a moment to breathe. His father's voice sounded older over the line, stripped of the physical presence that had once made it feel imposing. He spoke slowly, with pauses that suggested he was choosing honesty over efficiency. He said he had been thinking about the night Lucas left, about the arguments leading up to it, about decisions made under pressure and fear. Lucas listened without interrupting, his attention fixed not on the words alone, but on the effort behind them. This was not an apology rehearsed for leverage. It was an attempt, imperfect and belated, to articulate something long avoided. Lucas felt his defenses shift, not lowering but adjusting. His father admitted that there had been another factor that night, something they had never told Lucas. Financial strain had been part of it, but not the whole story. There had been an incident at school, a report that framed Lucas as a problem rather than a teenager struggling to cope. The way it was handled, the conclusions drawn, had hardened their fear into certainty. Lucas felt a jolt of recognition, fragments of memory clicking into place. He remembered the meeting, the uncomfortable chairs, the way adults spoke around him rather than to him. He had never known how much weight that moment carried afterward. Hearing it now stirred a mix of anger and grim clarity. The call ended without resolution, but with something like mutual exhaustion. Lucas sat in the dark afterward, the room quiet except for the low hum of the city outside. The new information did not change what happened, but it reshaped his understanding of it. He realized that his parents' failure had not been a single act, but a series of small decisions made without courage. The truth landed heavily, because it meant there was no singular villain to reject, only a chain of fear and avoidance that had ended with him on the outside. He wondered how many lives followed similar patterns, shaped by moments that were never fully examined. In the days that followed, Lucas found himself thinking about storytelling, about who controlled the narrative of a life. For years, he had carried a version of events that centered on abandonment, because it was the clearest way to make sense of his pain. Now, that story felt incomplete, not wrong, but unfinished. He did not feel compelled to rewrite it, but he sensed the importance of holding more than one truth at once. Survival, he realized, was not just about enduring circumstances, but about choosing which stories to keep telling. The insight left him reflective rather than resolved. His mother reached out soon after, asking if he might visit the house someday. Not immediately, but eventually. The invitation was tentative, framed as an option rather than an expectation. Lucas did not respond right away, sitting with the weight of the idea. Returning there would mean confronting physical spaces that still held echoes of his absence. It would mean standing in rooms that had continued without him, rooms where his absence had been normalized. The thought unsettled him more than he expected. Yet he could not deny a quiet pull toward closure, whatever form that might take. Late one night, Lucas stood by his window, watching lights flicker on and off in neighboring buildings. He thought about how many people lived with unresolved histories, how many carried silent versions of themselves shaped by decisions made long ago. He realized that his involvement with his family was no longer about money or even reconciliation. It was about understanding how the past continued to exert influence, even when one believed they had escaped it. As he turned away from the window, one question rose above the rest, steady and insistent. If he chose to step back into that house, would he finally reclaim the parts of himself left behind? Or would he discover that some distances, once crossed, could never truly be undone? Lucas agreed to visit the house on a Sunday afternoon, choosing the timing deliberately, when daylight would soften edges and reduce the power of shadows. The decision had not come easily, and even as he drove there, he felt a low tension coiled his chest, familiar and unwelcome. He reminded himself that he could turn back at any point, that agreeing to visit did not mean surrendering control. The neighborhood appeared unchanged, a quiet stretch of streets that seemed to exist outside of time, and that constancy unsettled him. He parked a block away, giving himself a moment to breathe, to steady his thoughts before stepping into a space that had once defined his world. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and warm pavement, ordinary and indifferent to his history. As he walked toward the house, memories surfaced not as sharp images but as sensations, the weight of a backpack on his shoulders, the sound of a door closing, the feeling of being abruptly unmoored. The house came into view slowly, its familiar shape stirring a mix of recognition and detachment. It looked smaller than he remembered, the paint slightly faded, the porch railing worn smooth by years of use. He noticed small changes, a different mailbox, new plants near the steps, signs of time moving forward without him. The sight did not provoke the surge of emotion he had feared, but it did awaken a quiet vigilance. He rang the bell and waited, his posture controlled, his expression unreadable. His mother opened the door, her face registering surprise despite knowing he was coming, as if part of her had doubted he would follow through. She stepped aside quickly, inviting him in with a gesture that felt both familiar and cautious. Lucas crossed the threshold deliberately, aware of the symbolic weight of the act, but refusing to dramatize it. The interior smelled faintly of cleaning products and something sweet, a scent he could not immediately place. The furniture arrangement had shifted, but the bones of the house remained the same, and that continuity felt more disorienting than change would have. His father stood in the living room, hands clasped, offering a greeting that hovered between warmth and restraint. They moved through the house slowly, guided more by implication than intention. Lucas noticed details he had never cared about before, small repairs, photographs rearranged, objects that suggested attempts at preservation. In the hallway, a framed picture caught his attention, an old family portrait he remembered reluctantly posing for. It hung at a slightly different angle now, as if someone had adjusted it and never quite set it straight again. He wondered how many times his parents had passed it without stopping, how many times they had noticed his absence and kept walking. The thought did not spark anger, only a sober understanding of how people adapt to loss by minimizing it. They sat in the kitchen, the same table occupying the space, its surface marked by years of use. Lucas felt the weight of sitting there again, the echo of arguments and silences layered into the room. His mother offered coffee, and he accepted out of habit rather than desire, noting how she avoided asking what he preferred. The conversation moved cautiously, touching on practical matters, the house repairs, neighborhood changes, mutual acquaintances whose lives had unfolded separately. Lucas listened, responding when necessary, his attention divided between the present and the undercurrent of what remained unsaid. The visit felt like a test of endurance rather than a reunion. Eventually, his father mentioned the school incident again, filling in details he had not shared on the phone. He spoke about fear, about warnings framed as certainties, about the ease with which authority had been mistaken for truth. Lucas felt a slow burn of anger rise, not explosive but steady, as the implications settled in. Decisions that had altered the course of his life had been made based on incomplete information and unchecked anxiety. He wondered how often that happened, how many children were shaped by adults' inability to sit with uncertainty. Hearing it articulated did not bring satisfaction, but it did bring coherence to a narrative that had long felt fragmented. Lucas asked questions then, specific and controlled, about who had said what, about why no one had asked for his perspective. His parents answered as best they could, sometimes hesitating, sometimes admitting they did not remember clearly. That uncertainty frustrated him, but it also confirmed something he had suspected for years. The past was not a fixed record, but a collection of impressions filtered through fear and self-protection. He realized that his own memories, sharp as they felt, were also part of that imperfect archive. The recognition did not weaken his experience, but it reminded him that clarity was always partial. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation shifted subtly, moving away from explanation and towards something more reflective. His mother spoke about the years after he left, about how the house had felt quieter, how routines had adjusted around a space no one mentioned. She did not frame it as suffering, but as absence, a presence defined by what was no longer there. Lucas listened, noting how carefully she avoided centering herself as the injured party. The restraint mattered to him, even as it underscored how long it had taken for this tone to emerge. He wondered whether such awareness could have existed earlier, whether timing alone had made this conversation possible. They moved to the back of the house, where Lucas's old room remained largely intact, repurposed but not erased. The bed was gone, replaced by storage boxes, but the walls still held faint marks where posters had once hung. Lucas stood in the doorway, feeling the weight of standing in a space that had once felt both safe and confining. He did not step inside immediately, allowing himself to register the distance between memory and reality. When he finally did enter, the air felt still, as if the room itself were waiting. He touched the wall lightly, grounding himself in the present. In that moment, Lucas felt something shift, not dramatically, but decisively. The room no longer felt like a site of loss alone, but like evidence of endurance, proof that he had carried something forward rather than leaving it behind. He realized that returning had not diminished him, nor had it restored what was lost. It had simply added another layer to his understanding of himself. His parents watched quietly, offering no commentary, and he appreciated the silence. Some moments, he knew, did not need to be filled. As the visit drew to a close, they stood on the porch together, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the yard. His mother thanked him for coming, her voice steady but subdued, and his father nodded in agreement. Lucas acknowledged them with a brief response, neither warm nor cold, simply present. He felt tired, but not drained, a distinction that mattered more than he expected. Driving away, he did not look back, not out of avoidance, but because he no longer needed to. The house had taken its place among many chapters of his life, no longer dominating the narrative. That night, back in his apartment, Lucas sat quietly, replaying the visit with a measured calm. He recognized that nothing had been resolved in conventional sense, no grand reconciliation achieved. Yet something essential had shifted. The story of his past now richer, more complex, less rigid. He understood that healing, if it existed at all, was not about restoring what had been broken, but about integrating what had been survived. As he prepared for bed, one final question settled into his thoughts, less urgent but deeply rooted. If he was now the one who carried the full story, not just a part shaped by exile, what responsibility did that give him toward the truth and toward the people who had once failed to tell it? Lucas returned to the house one last time a few weeks later. Not because he had been asked to, but because he had realized there were things he needed to say while the choice was still his. The decision felt quiet and deliberate, stripped of urgency or obligation, and that difference mattered. He arrived in the early evening, when the light softened the edges of the street and made everything look briefly forgiving. His parents greeted him with a familiarity that had grown cautiously since the last visit, careful not to assume too much. Lucas noticed how they waited for his cues now, how they allowed space instead of filling it. The shift did not erase the past, but it acknowledged it. They sat together in the living room, the television off, the windows open to let in the sounds of the neighborhood. Lucas spoke first, explaining why he had come, his voice steady and unhurried. He told them that he did not regret helping them financially, because it had been his decision, made with clear boundaries and open eyes. He made it equally clear that the help did not erase what had happened, nor did it obligate him to restore a relationship that no longer fit the shape of his life. His parents listened without interruption, and Lucas registered the restraint as a form of respect. This conversation, unlike so many before it, did not feel like a negotiation. It felt like a closing. He told them about the years they had missed, not in detail, but in meaning. He spoke about learning to trust himself when no one else would, about discovering that survival could become identity if left unexamined. He explained how their absence had shaped him, not just in hardship, but in independence, in the ability to choose his own values. His mother's eyes filled, but she did not cry, and his father kept his gaze fixed, absorbing each word with visible effort. Lucas did not soften his account to spare them discomfort. He had learned that honesty delivered gently was still honesty, and it was no longer his role to manage their feelings. When he finished, his father spoke, not to defend or explain, but to acknowledge. He said they had lived for years with a version of events that allowed them to function, even if it was incomplete. He admitted that fear had guided them more than care, and that the cost of that fear had been borne almost entirely by Lucas. His mother added that they had told themselves many stories to justify their silence, and that none of them had truly held up under scrutiny. The admissions were not dramatic or cathartic, but they were real, and Lucas felt their weight settled differently than before. This time, the truth was not being offered to secure something in return. Lucas realized then that the central mystery of his life had never been why they sent him away, but why they had stayed away for so long afterward. Hearing them articulate their avoidance, their shame, their fear of reopening wounds they did not know how to tend, answered that question in a way nothing else could. It did not excuse their choices, but it resolved the uncertainty that had haunted him. The silence had not been proof of his unworthiness, but evidence of their limitations. The distinction mattered more than he had ever expected it to. It allowed him to finally separate his identity from their failure. As the conversation wound down, Lucas stood and prepared to leave, feeling neither rushed nor reluctant. At the door, his mother hesitated, then asked if he would like to stay in touch. Not regularly, not with expectations, but occasionally. Lucas considered the question carefully, aware that this moment would set the tone for whatever came next. He told her he was open to limited contact, on his terms, and that he would reach out when and if he chose. The clarity of the boundary felt solid, not defensive, and his parents accepted it without protest. That acceptance, more than anything else, signaled that something fundamental had changed. Driving home, Lucas reflected on how easily lives have fractured and how difficult it was to examine the fractures without turning away. He thought about the boy he had been at 15, standing on a porch with no plan and no safety net, and he felt a tenderness toward that version of himself he had rarely allowed. That boy had survived without answers, without apologies, without guarantees. The man he had become did not need the past be rewritten to move forward. He needed it to be understood. Understanding, he now knew, was something he could claim for himself. In the weeks that followed, contact with his parents remained minimal and contained, exactly as he had intended. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no sudden closeness, only a quiet acknowledgement of shared history and separate futures. Lucas noticed that the story he told himself about his life began to change subtly, no longer centered on abandonment alone, but on endurance and choice. He found himself less reactive, less guarded, as if a long-held tension had finally loosened. The past no longer demanded his constant attention. It had taken its place as context rather than command. One evening, Lucas sat at his desk and began to write, not as therapy or confession, but as record. He wrote about the night he left, the years that followed the return, and the conversations that had reshaped his understanding. He wrote not to absolve anyone, but to preserve the truth as he now understood it, layered and imperfect. He realized that stories survived not because they were neat, but because someone chose to tell them honestly. In writing, he felt a sense of ownership he had never fully claimed before. This was his narrative now, no longer defined by what had been withheld from him. When he finished, he closed a notebook and sat quietly, the city humming outside his window. He felt no need to share what he had written, at least not yet. The act itself had been enough. Lucas understood that some stories did not end with reconciliation or revenge, but with clarity. They ended when the person at their center chose meaning over mystery, truth over silence. His family had come back for reasons shaped by fear and need, but what remained after all of it was something simpler and stronger. He had survived, he had chosen his boundaries, and he had claimed his story. Some stories survive only because someone chooses to tell them. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, told slowly, honestly, and without looking away.